It is interesting. Oracle was arguing pretty aggressively with Sun to loosen the licensing scheme for Java when they didn't own it. And things changed earlier this year. You know, we're talking about capitalism, which I'm a raging capitalist. I'm a total believer in, and I think it's the right thing, and it creates the right kind of byproducts, goods and services, employment, and it creates what I call national economic heroes, taxpayers. They're not villains, they're not greedy, they're national economic heroes. I'll tell you what, Mineta Airport shouldn't be named after Norm Mineta. He paid hardly no taxes, and he spent a lot of taxpayer dollars. It should be the Larry Ellison International Airport, because he's a national economic hero. Or the Meg Whitman Airport. She wasn't trying to buy an election. She paid an enormous amount of taxes to help California run a massive deficit. But I digress a little bit. So I'm giving Larry a little grief, but at the same point, you know, there are copyright laws, there are intellectual property laws, there are patents, and I believe in patents. I'm sorry, I think that there has to be some protection for major intellectual property investment. And why do I say that? Let's just talk about pharmaceuticals. Let's talk about the legal drug industry, not Prop 23 or whatever that was. So if we didn't have patents and we went to generic immediately, I can guarantee you that the R&D in the pharmaceutical companies would drop massively. Because if there's no hope for return by having patent protection and having X, you can argue about the number of years, but it isn't zero. Maybe it isn't 100 years, but you can argue about what the number is between 0 and 100 for allowing people to do drug development and get a return on it. And you know, I think that's important, unless you all want to live lower quality of life and die sooner. So you can argue against patents, but I think they're important and I think they're valuable. And again, price controls I also think are bad. If you have price controls on drugs, then you will have less profits. If you have less profits with the drug companies, you'll have less R&D, and we're all going to die sooner. That's the fundamental if-then of that environment. So do I have a problem with Larry Ellison buying Sun? No, that's part of the capitalist. You know, as soon as we go public, we're for sale. That's part of the deal. And do I have a problem with him exercising legal intellectual property rights? No, I don't have any problem with that. Would it be how we necessarily run and operate it? Obviously not. But again, I get back to, I was a good capitalist. He's a great capitalist. He's a better national economic hero than I was. So, you know, that's how I feel about it. I just, the impact of, there's two arguments. Windows was not open, but it had a bigger impact than Solaris. So it's also hard to predict. I mean, Larry may spend far more in R&D on Java if he gets a big bag of money from Google for using it than we did through the open community. So it's not, I believe in open and sharing, especially when it comes to fundamental infrastructure software like databases or like Java or like operating systems or whatever. But he may actually do better with his model. So I can't necessarily predict that one will be better than the other. It really depends on how well he executes with the revenue he generates and where he puts that money. Yes?
Do you think that Oracle's handling of the open Solaris movement is foreshadowing your larger stance on open source, or do you think that was a one-time event?
The question is, do you think Larry's handling of Open Solaris is foreshadowing of how he's going to handle all of his open source assets, or was that a one-time event? I have not talked to Larry in a year and a half, maybe a year. And I haven't talked to him for sure since change of control and I got fired. I didn't get fired, I got laid off, or how do you call that? Rift. So I don't really know what he's thinking. I just know he's not a huge fan of sharing. So would I count on more releases to the community of any Oracle paid for engineering going forward? I wouldn't count on it. I'm not saying that some code might not escape Oracle's labs into the community, but probably only if Larry doesn't know about it, would be my guess. But I'm guessing. I mean, you'll have to go ask him. I don't want to speak for Larry. Yes?
Do you have any predictions for what Oracle's going to do with Java?
Do I have any predictions of what Oracle will do with Java? No, I never was a visionary. I was only good at explaining to people what had already happened and that they hadn't figured out and they hadn't taken advantage of. And everybody thought I was a visionary, but I was never really great at predicting what would happen. The good news is it's hard to put open source code back in the bag once it's out there. So I think the world is going to fork all of the major. So there's Nexenta, you ought to check out. They're doing some good stuff in storage around some of the old Open Solaris stuff and ZFS stuff. There's a company called ForgeRock that's European-based, former Sun employees that are taking a lot of the Sun middleware open source stuff and moving that forward. And there's going to be, the open source, the open office community will continue to rock and roll, and I think you'll see people taking the Java technology and moving it forward. So I think all of these things, that's the beauty of open source, is if your supplier goes away, there will be somebody else who will be happy to lead the parade and provide support and engineering, all the rest of it. You basically have, I always refer to open source code as putting your product source code in escrow on the internet for free and available to everybody. If you remember when Oracle bought the app server company, help me with the name, the BEA. The problem with BEA is that all of that code wasn't open source. So if you were stuck on BEA and Oracle buys it and then Oracle says, we're no longer engineering releases to BEA, you had to say, all right, now what do I do? Do I go from WebLogic to Tomcat or some other open source, or do I go from WebLogic to the Oracle app server? Well, it turns out it's hard to migrate off if you don't have the source code. Oracle engineers were the only ones who had source code, and the Oracle engineers would only help you go from WebLogic to the Oracle app server. Now, it would have been a lot simpler if the WebLogic source code had been on the internet. You could have gone to anybody because any engineer could look and say, oh, now I can migrate you off because I have the exit ramps in source code in my possession. I can see not just how the manual says it can work, I can actually see the theory of operations in reality by looking at the source code. So migration becomes a lot easier in that model. So again, that's lowering the barriers to exit. The barriers to exit for stuff that's open source is actually fairly low compared to the barriers to exit for proprietary code.